it's clear when you read Genesis 6 through 9, if you know anything about Atrahasis or the Epic of Gilgamesh or the Sumerian Ziusudra stories, you're going to be like, oh my God, like this is the Mesopotamian flood story. Okay, I get it. In the story of Atrahasis, or the Mesopotamian flood tradition, the god that sends Enlil, the god that sends the flood to destroy humanity, is the bad guy. You have the Mesopotamian story that developed, at the beginning of the second millennium and was well known to the Judean scribes.
Hello lovely people, my name is Emma. Welcome back to my channel and welcome if you are new. Today I am very pleased to share with you a conversation I had with the wonderful Dr. Josh Bowen. You may recognise him as the author of The Atheist's Handbook to the Old Testament, volumes 1 and 2. If you haven't read those, I highly recommend. I'll put a link in the description. Josh is an expert in the ancient Near East. He's an Assyriologist, specialising in Sumerian, Akkadian and Hebrew languages. He's an absolutely fabulous speaker. His books are really wonderful. He is another scholar with an interesting perspective who came from a fundamentalist evangelical perspective, and that was why he studied the Old Testament with such fascination, and that led to a new, more skeptical perspective. We're talking today about the intertextuality between Old Testament myths and other ancient Near Eastern mythology texts that the Bible may have borrowed, been inspired by. If you're interested in the topic, Dr. Josh has a 7-part lecture series online. I'll tell you more about that at the end, but there's a link down below. Do check it out. Enjoy! Dr. Josh, thank you so much for gracing us with your beautiful face and one of your fabulous bow ties.
Oh my gosh. Well, I'm very happy to be here. It's incredibly kind.
We're here because you have a new multi-part lecture series on myths borrowed by the Old Testament, sort of intertextuality between Hebrew Bible stories and other ancient myths. And I kind of wanted to just get right in at the beginning because I was interested from just the title, because I think the use of the word borrowed is very interesting. Because in the skeptic community, something that I hear quite a lot, hear people argue, is the Bible stole or plagiarized or, something like that, this story. And I've heard you talk before about why maybe a little bit more nuance might be needed. So I'd love for you to share your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So I think a couple of things are in order. First of all, I completely understand the use of that term, right? And I think colloquially speaking, that's fine. Because the way that we think about that, particularly something like the Bible, the Bible is supposed to be this unique, handed down by God, sort of group of texts. And, in reality, it's not really how that happened, right? And so I think that because so many of us have been brought up with that understanding of the text, that finding out that actually, hey, this flood story comes from somewhere else, right? It's not original to Genesis. That can be very disconcerting and annoying, maybe to a certain extent, because you're thinking, wait a minute, like I thought this was God's book, right? If they're just taking it from Gilgamesh, like, what the heck? And so utilizing the word plagiarize in that context, I think is fine. If we're trying to be precise, though, in these conversations, I think plagiarism is it has some connotations in this discussion that maybe we don't want to put forward. The first is bad, right? Like plagiarize, that's a bad word. When I started at Hopkins, there's a whole seminar in orientation dedicated to don't plagiarize. Here's what plagiarism is, don't do it. Here's what'll happen if you do. So immoral, bad, you're stealing somebody else's intellectual property. And so I think in this context, if we use that term and people are understanding us to mean that could do with some nuance. So in the ancient world, particularly in the periods that we're talking about, in the BCE time frame, it wasn't a bad thing to utilize earlier mythologies, earlier stories. In fact, it's the way you did it. Right? And I think there are examples of this today that we see that I think would resonate or make sense, right? Like Christmas carols. We're very slow to develop Christmas carols. People like when new songs, if they allow them into their repertoire or whatever, that they're only going to do so often if they're more true to the original, right? People want the good old Christmas songs, right? And I think the same thing with hymns. And the reason is because we value tradition and we value things that have this feel of antiquity. That's why I think it's important when we come to this discussion as atheists, as skeptics, that we don't overplay our hand, right? And we don't say things like, "Oh, they stole this," because that's not really the case. And I think that gives, somebody that's an apologist or a fundamentalist evangelical or something, sort of a foothold to say, it's not really stealing, right? And then the conversation can go down. So I think understanding this interplay between ancient texts, which we're going to call intertextuality, is really important to understand. That's one of the things that we go into a great deal of detail about in the course, how there was interplay and what it meant.
Well, that's great. And that leads me to another, which you've already started to answer, so thank you. Another apologetic argument that I struggle with is one in which the differences between myths are highlighted when you come to discuss the similarities between ancient myths and Bible stories, and someone will say, aha, but there are these differences. I read one the other day that was a list of the differences between Genesis and Enuma Elish. One's monotheistic, one's polytheistic, and I find that problematic, but I struggle to articulate exactly why.
Yeah.
So I thought I would basically beg you for your more nuanced thoughts.
No, I think it's the sword that can cut both ways, right? What often the apologist is trying to do is to, when they highlight those differences, I'm not sure they know exactly where they're trying to go, because nobody's arguing that the stories are exactly the same.
Right.
And again, sort of to take it out of something contentious, the example that I often give is Eminem's song, and now I'm blanking on the name of it, but it's the song that he utilizes major sections of Joan Jett's "I Love Rock and Roll." Nobody looks at Eminem and says, "Plagiarize," right? Or, "Ooh, that's bad." But nobody doubts, nobody argues that he came up with those sounds on his own, right? We immediately, and that's how he designed it, right? We immediately in our heads make the connection to Joan Jett. That's a major part of why he's doing it, because he wants the audience to make that connection. But the question is why, right? And so we have to ask those questions of ancient texts. Why is it that this story is in many ways overtly like throwing up flags to like signal the reader, remember this story? So one of the ways that I do this in the course is I talk about, outside of the Bible, how the Enuma Elish did this to an earlier Akkadian myth. So one from the same culture, right? And I just to sort of tease everybody, there's an earlier story called the Anzu myth. And the Anzu myth is a story about this giant mythological bird who's incredibly powerful, who steals the tablet of destinies from Enlil, like the chief god, and it throws the whole divine world into disorder. And like a god Ninurta has to be sort of called upon to go and fight Anzu. There are certain phrases that are used in the story repeatedly. There are certainly themes. There's literary structure that are reworked into the Enuma Elish, so much so that anybody in that culture hearing Enuma Elish would go, sounds an awful lot like the Anzu myth. Why would they do that? It's not accidental, right? Because they're making clear connections. They're using this, there's a repeated phrase, for example, let the wind carry Anzu's feathers like off to the gods to like show that he's been defeated, right? Well, this line is brought into the Enuma Elish, and when Tiamat is killed, it says, "Let the wind bear her blood." Wind doesn't really bear blood very well. I mean, we've all seen weird, CSI, right? I mean, it can do it, I guess, but not in the same way that it does feathers. And so, why is it that the writer, is trying to draw attention back to the earlier Anzu myth? And it's because he's making a theological point, and that's the key. And this is how I would respond and do respond in these conversations is, yes, they are different. That's the point, right? So I'll give a very quick example, just one of many that we talk about later. It's clear when you read Genesis 6 through 9, if you know anything about Atrahasis or the Epic of Gilgamesh or the Sumerian Yasudra stories, you're going to be like, oh my God, like, nice. This is the Mesopotamian flood story. Okay, I get it. The differences are what make it special. And that we do need to pay attention to them because they're the things that the writer and the editors are trying to highlight, right? So one of the differences is that in the story of Atrahasis, or the Mesopotamian flood tradition, the god that sends Enlil, the god that sends the flood to destroy humanity, is the bad guy. He's called wicked. He's called evil. He's called rash, right? Like he does this thing, without really thinking it through. Yahweh, he's certainly not the bad guy for sending the flood. As a matter of fact, people have become so wicked that if Yahweh didn't send the flood, the writer would be thinking, or the reader would be thinking, like, boy, he's letting them get away with stuff, right? So that's the point, right? That's the theological message. One of them that's coming across in the Genesis flood story is that, sure, we're down with the flood story, right? We acknowledge that, right? It's just our God, and our God wasn't wicked for doing it, right? He had to do it. So it's not, as I so often say, probably shouldn't be given my age, but sick flex, bruh, right? When an apologist says, yeah, but look at the differences. Yeah, but that's not the relevant point. The relevant point is that there's dependency, right? This is the point that skeptics and atheists are trying to make in these conversations is, hey, it's not original to the Bible, right? That's the point. We're not trying to say that there's no difference. We're just trying to say that it's utilizing earlier mythology. That's it, right? So pointing out differences is like, yeah, how does that help you?
Something that I've kind of heard in response to this, that these Hebrew Bible myths and legends are borrowing things from earlier, some of the sort of apologetic, I guess the general Christian sort of response can be that maybe that's because of some idea of like shared memory, that the similarities between the creation myths implies some sort of historical origin. And my sort of instinctive reaction is that kind of overlooks the influence that these cultures have on each other and that texts and myths have on each other. But I'd love to hear your thoughts.
There's an entire, actually, I think 2 lessons or 2 lectures in that course that go into why is it that scholars say that there is either indirect or direct dependence of passages like Genesis 1 or the entire span of Genesis 1 through 11 or the flood story. Why is it that we don't think that it's just like a shared memory of an actual flood? There's so many problems with this idea of there being an actual flood that this is based on, right? But to sort of stick to this, one of the things that we kind of go out of our way to highlight is the similarity of shared language, right? So one could make the argument that it just happened that Eminem came up with these riffs, right? Like this sound of I love rock and roll. I mean, like that's sort of out there in the culture, right? And like maybe he just kind of came up with that on his own. Like Vanilla Ice, maybe Vanilla Ice, really didn't steal that track from steal. So here I'm doing it, right? Didn't utilize that track from Queen, right? I think it was Queen. Yeah, Under Pressure. By the way, if you want to hear something incredibly nerdy, when I was in seminary, I had a friend and we would play that song and we would say "Hoopa Thlipsis," which is Greek for under pressure.
Wow, that is super nerdy. Thank you.
It's super nerdy, right? It's a self-burn. Those are rare. So yeah, but like one could make that argument, right? The Vanilla Ice, he just kind of came up with it, right?
Parallel creativity, that kind of thing. Parallel creation.
Right. The problem is that what's the probability that he's going to come up with dum, 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 dum. But if we wanted to try to actually delve, like actually build a case for Eminem utilizing Joan Jett, we would look at at the song itself, right? And there's interplay. He uses actual similar phrases, right, in the song. And so the more similarity that you have, particularly when you have words or phrases that look like they're being forced in, like a square
Hmm.
peg in a round hole, it's building the case, like the
Blood on the
probability.
air. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's right. So what they call that, that the blood being borne off by the wind is a blind motif, right? And it's something that is being worked in to the story specifically so that the reader like goes back and makes that connection. So if
Hmm.
you and I were having an argument and I got really mad and I was trying to uh, work something in, I might say like, "Bye, Felicia." Well, and that would draw you back to the movie Friday, and maybe I'm
Hmm.
saying something about you, like if or saying something about me or whatever. Um, but really, it didn't fit in the context very well.
Hmm.
That would be very strong evidence that I have the movie Friday in mind. Right? Whereas if I say, or if I were to say, boy, he's really sponge-worthy, right? That would be clear that I'm thinking about the show Seinfeld, right? And Elaine's line about a man being sponge-worthy. But if I were to say yada yada yada, well, yeah, that's a show on Seinfeld called the Yada Yada. But I mean, like that's something that's sort of out there in the culture. So if that's
Hmm.
all we had, yada 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 is common enough that you can't build the case very strongly anyway, that
Right.
unless there are other things that are supporting it that I'm actually, but if you had Spongeworthy and Serenity Now in like the same context, and then I said yada yada yada, it wouldn't be definitive. You'd have a better case for saying that yada 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 is drawing back on that Seinfeld episode. So this is the sort of thing that we have when you look at the use of the word build in the creation story. Like Eve is built. It uses the Hebrew word banah, which is a weird word to use for create
Hmm.
in Hebrew. Like we've got bara, we've got Yatsah, we've got Asa. We have these, or Yatsar, we have Asa. We have these words that are used in these creation, these cosmogonic texts to form something, right? Or to make something or to
Hmm.
create something. But we don't usually see building something. And that's the word that's like used for like building a house or something, right? When you go back to the Mesopotamian stories, guess what verb they use? Because they're Semitic languages. They use
Hmm.
the verb banum, which is the Hebrew cognate of bana. They say the human was built. And so, like, we have lots of things like that where you have these specific lexicographic connections
Hmm.
between these stories, and they're not just oh, this is in an Akkadian text and this is in a Hebrew text. No, it's in an Akkadian text and a Hebrew text in the same context, right? This story of creation and something that it's not used elsewhere, right? And so there are lots of words, several words like that, and this is amongst other things, broad structure, the clear use of polemics. Like these are things that lead us not to say there's this common source that both are drawing from, but instead you have the Mesopotamian story that developed, at the beginning of the second millennium and was well known to the Judean scribes, and
Hmm.
and they are utilizing this story. They're not both pulling from a common source.
Along those lines, I remember from your interview on Myth Vision, um, that your own sort of original view of inerrancy was kind of challenged by understanding these like older influential myths. I wondered if you could touch on how this does affect a sort of literalist interpretation of the Bible, that knowing that these are inspired and drawing directly from and directly referencing older myths.
Yeah, I had a conversation on Clubhouse last night. So like a audio app like Discord,
Mhm.
and uh, there's there was a guy that made a comment, and he said, "Yeah, all of the divine pantheons, right? All of the deities and all the mythologies, all come from Babylon, like all of them in the world." So, of course, my brain went to, okay, like this conversation that we're having, right? Like the Hebrew Bible is utilizing Mesopotamian mythologies, but that's not the only place that they utilize
Hmm.
mythologies from. Like Ugaritic has a whole, group of texts, and we talk about those in the course as well. But like Baal, there's a Baal cycle, and you have clear influence from it. So the idea that it's all coming from Mesopotamia is, I mean, it's just not true, right? So I came off of
Hmm.
mute and I said, well, it's a little more nuanced than that to sort of say that diplomatically.
Hmm.
Well, this person got very angry, right? And really pushed back hard on me. And I said, well, this sort of my field. So like we could talk about it, but no, you're wrong. You're wrong. Okay. Um, what he meant by it actually was not that it goes back to Babylon like Babylonia. He meant like the Tower of Babel in Genesis 11. Right? Like
Right.
he's taking, as you say, this sort of fundamentalist evangelical literalistic approach to the text where
Hmm.
you have like an actual Adam and Eve 6,000 years ago, and you have a flood. So whole different conversation when that's the approach that you're taking, because if that is your view, it all has to come from one source, right? I mean, like
Yeah.
it's how it works. When we talk about these types of mythologies, though, what you quickly realize is that, for example, Israel wasn't a thing until the 13th century at the earliest, right?
Hmm.
And even then, they're like proto-Israel, right? So they're Israel in development in the Iron Age. Um, and so like you don't have before that they're Canaanites, right? They're the local Canaanites. So
Hmm.
this idea that you have like this independent set of mythologies that are coming down in this pristine fashion or something is like, no, that doesn't work. And so, for me, recognizing that these myths developed in different ways in different parts of the ancient Near East before they came anywhere near the Hebrew Bible was just flatly contradictory to my understanding of, like these stories being handed down, let's say, to Moses, right? He's putting the
Hmm.
Pentateuch together in the 15th century or something like that just doesn't work with that. Of course, there were broader implications with like, historical problems with the Hebrew Bible, but
Hmm.
once I recognized that either I had to have incredible supernatural intervention, in my opinion, and superintending to sort of preserve through oral tradition all of these myths in such a way that they would look just like they were borrowed from
Yeah.
Mesopotamian and Ugaritic texts, and we would have no evidence of that historically when
Hmm.
when it was that, or uh, these are human beings, right? During the Iron Age, that are or later that are putting down in writing these mythological texts and utilizing traditions that are around them. Uh, the fundamentalist option just sort of seemed nonsensical to me. But I will say, and actually said this in that conversation, I don't think that anything that we're talking about here like nullifies the possibility that Christianity is true. It just
Hmm.
means that I think you have to vastly reinterpret if you're a fundamentalist evangelical. I think you have to change the way you come to the texts, right? And I think it probably means you have to change the way you think about the deity. And there are lots of people, obviously, that do that. I don't think anybody listening to this should say, oh, Josh just hates Christianity. Josh hates the Bible. And I'm like, Megan's a Christian, right? So, I mean, miss me with that shit. Um, it has nothing to do with my hatred for a religious tradition or anything like that. It doesn't exist. There is no hatred for a religious tradition. All I'm trying to say is that when we come to these texts and these traditions, let's have good data points that we're starting from, and then let's utilize interpretive frameworks that make them make sense, as opposed to trying to pigeonhole our presuppositions about how this text must have come into being and must have functioned in the ancient world and how it should be applied today. Let's not push for 10 commandments to be put in all the classrooms, right? Maybe let's not do
Hmm.
that.
Too late.
Yeah, too late, right? Because that's the sort of thing that's like, all right, I have this fundamentalist evangelical approach to the text, so that means I think Exodus 20, and if that's the one that we're using, if that's the set of 10 commandments that we're using, I think that should be put in all the classrooms because like this is the way I want a theonomy or something. Like if we actually go through the 10 commandments in full and you see things like don't covet your neighbor's slaves, probably don't want that part put in the classroom, right? But yeah, I think it's just having a more reasonable interpretive model through which to view these texts.
It's funny that you mentioned that because I just did a video about the Louisiana law, the 10 Commandments in schools, and I sort of the way that I talked about it was just by reading the 10 Commandments.
Yeah,
because there's something about that kind of fundamentalist, that kind of literalist that you think, I don't know if they really are literalist about the 10 Commandments, for example. Right. I feel like everyone in their own religious journey, and this is why I talk about it, knowing about these myths and stuff, challenging literalism and fundamentalism in different ways, because you can be a Christian and not, and accept that there are errors maybe made by man throughout the stories, and that maybe there were influences and things like that. So I think that's I think it's really interesting.
I put up a meme on Twitter or X or whatever it's called now. And it was that that 4-panel thing meme. And it says, atheists should stop taking the Bible out of context. And in the top right panel, the person responded with, isn't that what you're doing with the 10 Commandments? And then the last two are the guy thinking and then getting angry. It's interesting to me because one, like, I think that so many people don't read the Old Testament, right? Or the Hebrew Bible. And so what they have is not an actual understanding of the 10 Commandments. They have this abstracted, sort of watered down, simplistic version, right? The 10 little things that you see in Sunday school. Don't lie, don't steal, don't cheat, whatever. But really, like, it's not quite what it is. But where they do really seem to dig down in is something like Leviticus 18, right? Because we don't want that LGBTQ plus stuff in here, right? But we're not really delving into Deuteronomy 25, right? Where it says if two men are fighting and a woman comes in to rescue her husband and grabs his assailant by the testicles, he cut her hand off. Maybe we're not reading that one so closely. Oh, it's Old Testament, Moses, Old Covenant, right? But the homosexuality stuff, boy, we really got to make sure we focus in on that one, right? And so again, I think that this is why taking this step back, starting at where did we get the text? Where did we get these stories? Where do these law collections come from, right? Is it really about slavery? Yep. And where does that come from? These are questions that if we can begin there, I think it's much easier for someone moving forward, reading through the Hebrew Bible. It'll be easier for them to say, this really does sound a lot like what was going on just in general in the ancient Near East. Maybe there's not this divine aspect to it that I think there is. An apologist friend of mine, one of his students, called me to do a phone interview about my deconversion. And one of the questions that he asked me toward the end was, if you ever became a God believer again, what do you think that would look like? And, I said, I think probably the way that I would view that is, I would see like a God interacting with humanity in such a way that humans took that experience and, for example, wrote texts about it. It's not that the deity was coming down and moving men of old so that he wrote exactly as they wanted them to, right? It's they're in their human, fallible, whatever situation. They're writing based on in reaction to intention with this experience that they had. And so that's why you can have Mesopotamians talking about Enki and Enlil, and here because that was their experience with the divine. But then the Israelites say, no, it's Yahweh, and here's our experience with the divine. And this is why, Islam can have, their experience with the divine. They can all be different, but it's because they're humans responding to an actual experience with the divine through their own interpretive lenses. Like that would make sense to me. But what that means, if we assume that to be the case for the sake of argument, that means that if I, as a religious person, come up to you, Emma, and say, you need to do it based on my interpretation, I feel like that would be equivalent to the two of us standing and looking at a painting. And I say, this painting makes me feel really good. And like, I want to go do good for people. And you look at it and say, I don't know, there's something about it that makes me kind of feel sad. And I turn to you and say, you're wrong. And Emma, you have to adopt my interpretation of this painting. Well, that sounds ludicrous to us, right? And it is, because that's not how interpretations work when it comes to things like art. Why is it that we feel that we can take our interpretation of an ancient text and say, you have to do it like I interpret this ancient text to be speaking to me? I think that's a ridiculous notion.
I completely agree. And I think there's a lot in there that kind of says maybe why the sort of fringes, or even not the fringes, especially maybe in the USA, but the sort of closer to the edges of evangelism and more literalism and fundamentalism is maybe less empathetic than other, more liberal sort of versions of that religion, because there isn't room for alternative interpretations. There isn't a room for the just human fallibility and differences. So I think I think it's a good thing for people to learn.
John Collins, professor at Yale, the Hebrew Bible, he wrote a book, What Are Biblical Values? I think is the title. It's like a 2018, 2019 publication. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that he says in there is that, paraphrasing here, that when you have this more fundamentalist view of the text, that is that you say, God handed it down, so it's directly from him. What we have, God has preserved, and so it's exactly what we're supposed to have. God moved men of old to write it in the way that they did, and we have the Holy Spirit inside of us to help us interpret the text. Once that becomes sort of the standard lens through which you view the Bible, there is no negotiation. And on these, what they would say like our primary issues of the faith, like you can't negotiate on those things. This is the way that it is, right? And when that happens, he says that there's nothing left but violence. If you're convinced, right, that I'm standing on train tracks and there's a train coming, you might not want to go, tackle me to get me out of the way. But if you stand there and say, there's a train coming, and I go, whatever, Emma, like your obligation as a good person, right, is to go tackle me, and that might hurt, right? But you've got to get me off those train tracks so that I don't die. Well, that's exactly how they're viewing this. Mm-hmm. Hell is coming, right? The rapture could happen any minute. And if that's the case, Josh, I've got to save you, right, from this. And even against your will, right? Depending on the context. Like that's the thing that's inside so many people. Certainly was inside of me. Mm-hmm. And I think that when you can't have compromise, which fundamentalist evangelicals really can't when you get down to it, mm-hmm. there aren't other ways, right? And that's the point that he makes, is violence is sort of like what's left to make that come about, right? Which is, I think, what we see historically.
And I think even in a modern context, this sort of idea, this certainty that, well, I mean, I know this because the Holy Spirit because it's from God. This is divine. I know this to be completely true. You have, say, a Christian, and then say a Muslim who has the exact same opinion of their interpretation. There is absolutely no room between the two to even comprehend each other's perspective, maybe, and so it ends up becoming something violent because what explanations do you have for why where they say they're as convinced as you, but they can't really be because you know that you're right. Yeah.
If my text says that this land is mine and your text says that no, it's mine, like we see this back as early as the third millennium, that we have these two city states, the city of and the city of Lagash in Mesopotamia, down in southern Mesopotamia. And like we have the text. Now they're all from Lagash. All the texts, all the stories, all the accounts of this are from Lagash, from one city. So go figure, the city, was wicked and awful. And you wouldn't believe, Emma, how terrible they were. And so Ningirsu, the god of Lagash, we had to, as the Lagashites, sorry, we had to go fight against and conquer because think about how bad what would have happened if we hadn't done that, right? If we had texts from preserved extant from that city, they would say our god Shara. Right? Think about how terrible the Lagashites were. Like we had to go fight against them, right? Like this is just how this works. When you're convinced that the divine has revealed itself to you in such a way that you can't be wrong about it, where do you go?
I feel like that's a really good, way to view this kind of just the value of history and education in general, coming from a religious perspective. For obviously more viewers of my channel will be skeptics. So I just wanted to sort of round off by asking you, for somebody who is maybe a skeptic who's interested in Bible history, or maybe they like to debate or get into discussions with apologetics or something like that, what is the value for those people in knowing more about these ancient myths and their connection with and influence on the Hebrew Bible?
I wrote a couple of books, the Atheist Handbook to the Old Testament.
You did? They're very good.
Volumes 1 and 2. And the way that the reason that they came about was just what you described, right? I was in these online circles and people like Mike Winger were saying things to huge audiences like, no, Daniel, the book of Daniel actually does date to the 6th century. And we have all kinds of evidence to support that. No, Mike, no, you don't. And actually it's not real slavery, right? It's just indentured servitude. It's just like having a credit card, right? It's all a journey. And so these sorts of, apologetic arguments kept coming up, and I kept thinking to myself, you guys are just wrong on so many levels. And so I wrote these books sort of tackling these individual problems, right? And one of the ones in the second volume that I sort of began to deal with is this idea of, like the Bible is unique in its mythological perspective, or in its, in its primeval history. And that sort of developed into this course because so many apologists stand on this idea that the Bible is something altogether different, right? And it's unique. Again, so many of them, an unfortunate number, I think, like view this literally. And so when you encounter someone like that, I think it's very eye-opening, to say the least, for someone to. I'll give a brief example. I deconverted in 2009, and I had pastored a church up through like the summer of 2009. Wow. So it was at the end of the year that I deconverted. And so I was still attending that church, right? And but you can imagine I'm attending with people that I've pastored for 7 years. And now it's not that I don't believe this doctrine, this version of this type of doctrine that they hold. I don't believe this God is real anymore. And they don't know. And so I was asked to teach a Sunday school class one day, and like one of the things that I wanted to do, because I care about these people, right? As I wanted to sort of introduce them to the idea that, the text isn't unique in that way.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there are lots of evangelicals, obviously, that know that, right? And they come up with apologetic arguments for why it is that that's okay. And so my end goal was to say that they're not unique. There are these older stories, but don't worry, like don't lose sleep over this necessarily, because there are very intelligent, very educated evangelical scholars that are working on this, right? So but you need to be aware of it. Right.
Mm-hmm.
In the same way that you need to be aware that if you don't brush your teeth, you're going to get cavities, but don't lie awake at night that you're going to get cavities, just brush your teeth. Right. And so better to know that you need to brush your teeth than to not. I have no idea if that analogy made any sense given what we're talking
I
about.
liked
Sorry.
it.
Yeah, well, good. I did this. They asked me to teach a Sunday school class. And so I put up on the screen this verse from like 1 Corinthians or something, but I didn't put 1 Corinthians, I didn't put the citation. And I said, all right, who are my amazing scholars in here? Where's this from? And, people are like, oh yeah, that's from 1 Corinthians, I was like, all right, cool. So I put one up from Ezekiel and they're like, oh, come on, give us a challenging one. That's from Ezekiel, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, all right, great. So I clicked the button and this paragraph came up. And it said, when the flood waters receded, I sent out the raven, and the raven, came back to me, didn't find any dry land. And they were like, oh, yeah, come on. Really? This flood story is Genesis 6-9, No. Then I clicked the button and the citation came up and it said Epic of Gilgamesh, Tablet 11, whatever. That did not go over exactly as I thought it would, right?
Yeah.
Because this is a group of fundamentalist evangelical Christians. That was such an eye-opening experience for them that it probably did one of two things. It probably, for some of them, made them dig deeper and maybe nuance their view. Let's call that unlikely. And it probably, for some of them, made them further entrench themselves in their fundamentalism and just say Josh is a God hater, right? And he's just making stuff up. It may have caused some of them to say those are Satan's stories, right? And Satan is purposely trying to trick us. But in any case, in these contexts, if you're going to talk to people that are evangelicals, or more precisely, I think, more fundamentalist evangelicals, knowing where these stories come from, it changes the dynamic of the discussion instantly. Because when they start talking about Tower of Babel and, here we have Garden of Eden, and you can be like, so do you know about the Epic of Gilgamesh? Have you read that? So who's Baal? Is he the rider on the clouds? Because if he is, what do you do here with this, in the Psalms? Or Isaiah 27:1, you have almost a direct quote from the Baal cycle. What do you do with that? If you can bring those things out, I think what it does is it sort of, I hate to use this sort of, but it puts a chink in the armor, right? And I think at least what it does is it makes the person take a step back and say, I haven't really considered that, a rhetorical standpoint for a debate or something, really puts them on their heels. But in a good way. I don't think it's dishonest or something. I think it's a good putting them on their heels, because it says we have to engage with the data points. Whatever your interpretive model is, it's got to account for the data points. And if these data points are saying that, I can show you where the flood story is utilizing earlier Mesopotamian mythology, your model has to account for that. And I think it's a really important thing to do with an apologist.
Amazing. I think this is going to be incredibly useful. I'm really excited for it. Thank you so much for talking to me today. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you for having me. No, I really appreciate it.
If you found this conversation interesting, which I certainly did, you will want to check out Dr. Josh's 7-part lecture series. Learn all about how the Old Testament writers utilized earlier myths to make their own theological points, get a better contextual understanding of these ancient myths about the creation of the world, the global flood, the origin of mankind. Registering for the course gives you lifetime access. You get all the materials forever. That's high-quality video recordings of all 7 lectures. You get fundamental FAQs, overviews of the lectures, printable and downloadable copies of all the presentation slides, printable transcripts of the videos, a bibliography and reading recommendations if you want to dive in further. Do consider checking it out via my affiliate link down below. That helps out me in this channel, as well as just giving you a fabulous education. Let's be honest, some of you love to debate on the internet, and this will help immensely when you're debating the Old Testament. It helps to know the surprising similarities between Sargon of Akkad's birth story and Moses being set adrift in a basket down a river, for example. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you once again to Dr. Josh for joining me today. I really had such a lovely time talking to him. He's a fabulous guy. If you enjoy these scholarly biblical conversations, there is a playlist of similar videos and interviews on my channel. Do consider checking that out. If you want to support this channel, you can also become a channel member right here. You get some silly little emotes, you get comment priority, and you get a little chickie next to your name. It's very cute. The best way to support this channel is via the Patreon. Patrons have access to a full uncut version of this interview along with interviews I've done in the past, which basically includes the not always as relevant but lighthearted and fun banter and jokes between myself and the interviewees. YouTube has a short attention span, so I tend to trim down, but if you wanted a more full version, that is on Patreon. With that, I must give a big old thank you and a shout out to my giant chickens and colossal quackers over on Patreon, especially Conla. God damn it, Conla. Most importantly, have yourselves a very lovely week, and I will see you really soon.